"Security, escort her out." Richard Whitmore's voice rang out before Annie Carter had taken more than 3 steps inside. The security guard standing beside the glass doors immediately looked up. The students waiting in line with their presentation boards turned to stare. Parents holding paper cups of coffee paused in place. Even the sponsors standing beneath the shining silver letters of the Whitmore Future Foundation fell silent. Richard Whitmore stood near the registration table, one hand tucked into the pocket of his perfectly tailored gray suit. Above him, a large banner glittered beneath the lights. "Building the Future Challenge. Designing spaces for the next generation." Richard looked Annie over, from her worn shoes to the faded hat on her head. Then he gave a quiet laugh. It was not a loud laugh, but it was loud enough for the entire room to understand what he thought of her. "This is the Building the Future Challenge," he said. "A design competition for serious young minds. Architects, engineers, designers. This is not a construction site, and that ragged hat on your head makes it look as if you just walked in off the street." Annie instinctively reached up and touched the brim of her hat. The hat had been faded by years of sun. There was a small tear near the seam on the left side, and the old fabric still carried stains that no amount of washing could fully remove. The woman at the registration table leaned toward another staff member and whispered softly enough to pretend she was being polite, but loudly enough for Annie to hear. "He's right. Anyone walking in right now would think we were getting ready to welcome a construction crew." The other staff member glanced quickly toward the front doors. "The reporters will be here in 20 minutes. "Exactly. Just imagine those photos." Annie heard every word. She stepped closer to the registration table, trying to keep her voice steady. "My name is Annie Carter. I'm finalist number 17. I'm here to submit my design." The woman in charge of registration looked down at the list. When she found the name, her expression shifted slightly, but her eyes did not soften. "She is on the list, Mr. Whitmore." Richard did not even look at the list. His eyes remained fixed on Annie. "Being on the list does not mean you understand where you are," he said. "Every finalist received instructions: business attire, professional conduct, respect for the institution." "I understand, sir," Annie said. "I really do. I took 2 buses to get here, almost 2 hours. Please, don't make me leave. This is my chance." She hugged the cardboard portfolio tightly against her chest. The edge had been patched with tape because the zipper had broken the night before. Inside were drawings, floor plans, and illustrations for a community learning center she had named Future Blocks. The corner of Richard's mouth lifted, but there was no warmth in his smile. 2 hours on a bus is not an excuse for walking into a formal competition looking as if you came here to repair the walls. Annie's face burned. "I didn't mean any disrespect." The woman at the registration table folded her arms. "Sweetheart, this is a national program. The sponsors are here. University representatives are here. The entire point of this event is to showcase excellence." "I brought my work," Annie said. "And appearance is part of the work," Richard replied at once. "Do you think the world only judges what is written on paper? The world judges whether you came prepared. Look at yourself." He gestured toward Annie, and the whole room seemed to follow the movement of his hand. Worn shoes, a wrinkled hoodie, a faded hat. You expect people to believe you came here to design the future when you look like you wandered in from a construction site? Annie tightened her grip on the portfolio. "My father used to wear this hat," she said quietly. "He was a builder." Richard let out a dry laugh. "Then your father should have taught you that sentiment is no substitute for standards." The word struck Annie harder than she expected. She swallowed, then took one small step forward. "Sir, please, I'm not asking you to give me anything. I'm only asking for the chance to submit what I earned the right to bring here." Richard turned to the security guard. "Why is she still standing here?" The guard hesitated. He was an older man, with tired eyes and a worn wedding ring on his hand. "Miss," he said much more gently than Richard, "I need you to come with me." "Please," Annie said, looking at him as her voice trembled. "Don't do this. I don't have another program waiting for me. I don't know anyone on the board. I don't have money to apply somewhere else. I just need 5 minutes at that table." The woman in charge of registration sighed. "Mr. Whitmore, people are starting to stare. If we let this continue, it will affect the entire competition." Richard nodded, as if she had just confirmed exactly what he already believed. "That is precisely the problem. Everyone is looking. She is damaging the image of this event before it has even begun." "I'm not trying to damage anything," Annie said. "No," Richard replied coldly. But you are. The security guard reached out and touched her arm. Come on, young lady. Annie stepped back. Wait, my design. Now, Richard said, before the cameras arrive. The security guard took hold of Annie's arm and moved faster than she was ready for. Annie stumbled, trying to hold on to the cardboard portfolio, but the taped edge tore open. Papers scattered across the polished floor. Floor plans, sketches, pencil notes, a drawing of a small courtyard where children sat reading beneath the shade of young maple trees. The portfolio dropped to the ground. When Annie bent down to pick it up, the old hat slipped from her head. It landed near Richard Whitmore's polished shoes. Annie tried to pull free from the security guard's grip. Please, wait. My hat. She bent down to reach for it, but Richard spoke first. Escort her out, he said. I'll pick up that hat and throw it after her. The security guard still held Annie by the arm. She looked at the hat lying on the floor, then at Richard. There was no anger left on her face now. Only shock. Richard bent down. He picked up the hat with 2 fingers, as if he were holding something filthy. He meant to toss it toward the door and end the scene before the sponsors grew impatient. But the moment his fingers touched the worn fabric, Richard suddenly froze. The material was softer than he had expected. It no longer held its original shape. Years of sun, wind, sweat, and weather had bent it into something entirely its own. For reasons Richard himself could not explain, the feeling of that hat in his hand made him stand still. The security guard pulled Annie another step toward the exit. My drawings, she said, her voice shaking despite her effort to hold it steady. One sheet of paper slid across the floor and stopped just in front of Richard's shoe. He glanced down. In the lower corner of the drawing, 2 small words had been written in pencil. For Dad. Richard was still holding the hat in his hand. Annie stood near the door, one hand gripping the worn strap of her torn backpack, the other reaching helplessly toward the pages scattered across the floor. Richard looked at the hat once more. Then he looked at Annie. After that, his gaze slowly returned to the drawings. Đúng, bản trước vẫn dài. Dưới đây là bạn đã ép xuống còn khoảng 1,5, 1,15 từ, giữ trọn mạch chính. Richard Whitmore did not understand why he was still holding that hat. He only knew he could not throw it away. The lobby stood frozen around him. Near the glass doors, the security guard still held Annie by the arm. Not cruelly, but firmly enough to keep her from leaving. Richard looked down at the hat in his hand. A minute earlier, it had looked embarrassing to him, an old work hat with torn stitching, faded fabric, and a brim bent by years of use. But now, resting in his palm, it felt strangely heavy. His eyes moved to the drawings scattered across the polished floor. One sheet had slid close to his shoe. In the corner, written in small pencil letters, were 2 words. For Dad. Wait, Richard said. The security guard stopped. Annie turned to look at him. She was no longer shrinking back. She had been humiliated enough to know that sudden kindness could sometimes become another kind of insult. Richard raised one hand. Let her stand there, he said. Don't take her out yet. The guard loosened his grip. Yes, sir. Richard looked at Annie. Come here. Annie did not move. Grace Miller, the young program coordinator near the registration desk, stepped forward. Mr. Whitmore, she said softly. Maybe she should pick up her drawings first. Richard kept his eyes on Annie. She can. But I need to ask her something. Annie swallowed, then walked back slowly, each step careful, as if the floor might vanish beneath her. Richard lifted the hat. This, he said. Where did you get it? Annie's face changed. It belonged to my father. Richard studied the torn stitching. Your father worked construction? Yes, sir. What kind? Everything, Annie said. Schools, apartments, churches, community centers. Wherever there was work, he took it. She paused. He was a builder. The woman at the registration desk sighed impatiently. Mr. Whitmore, the judges will arrive in less than 15 minutes. Richard ignored her. What was his name? He asked. Annie hesitated. Marcus Carter. The name fell softly into the lobby, but to Richard, it struck something deep inside his chest. Marcus Carter. He looked at the hat again. The embroidered letters inside the band had nearly faded away, but 2 initials remained. Mia, Si. The same initials Annie had just spoken. Richard's thumb brushed over the old thread before he realized what he was doing. Did he ever work in Georgia? Richard asked. Annie frowned. Mostly there. Atlanta, Macon, Decatur, wherever there was work. She looked confused. Why? Richard did not answer. The woman at the desk tried again. Sir, we can have staff bring her things outside. The press team is waiting. Grace turned to her. She is a finalist. She is disrupting the event. She was being dragged toward the door, Grace said. That was the disruption. The woman stared at her. Grace. Grace stood straighter, though her hands were tense. Richard finally looked at her. You know her? Only through her submission, Grace said. But her design deserves to be here. Annie looked at Grace as if she had not expected anyone in that building to defend her. Richard lowered the hat. Pick up her drawings. The security guard blinked. Sir? Help her. The guard released Annie and bent down. Grace knelt too, gathering the papers before anyone could step on them. Annie joined them, smoothing the corners with trembling fingers. Careful, she said when one page bent. Then she quickly added, Sorry. The guard handed her the floor plan. No, you're right. I've got it. Annie nodded. Thank you. Richard was still holding the hat. Annie noticed. May I have it back, please? What does it mean to you? Richard asked. This time, his voice was gentler. Annie held the drawings against her chest. It means my father is still walking with me. She continued before she could stop herself. He wore that hat on job sites for years. When I was little, he came home covered in sawdust, cement dust, paint whatever he had worked with that day. My mother always told him not to put it on the kitchen table, but he always forgot. A faint smile touched her mouth, then disappeared. He died 2 years ago. I wore it today, because this project was his idea before it became mine. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know where you are watching from, and do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories about family, courage, and justice. Richard's jaw tightened. What idea? My father said every neighborhood deserved a safe place for children to go after school, a place where they didn't have to buy a soda or prove they belonged there. Annie looked down at her drawings. He said a decent building could make tired people feel a little less tired. That is what I designed. Grace picked up the last sheet and read the title aloud. Future Blocks, a community learning center for working families. Richard took the drawing from her. He did not glance at it. He studied it. It showed a low building around a courtyard, with reading rooms, a workshop, a tool library, and a wide front porch facing the street. In the corner was the same note. For Dad. What is this porch for? Richard asked. Annie seemed surprised. For sitting. Then she added, more seriously. My father said too many buildings are designed to push people away. Stand here. Pay there. Wait outside. Leave when you're done. He said a porch tells people they are allowed to stay a little longer. Richard stared at the drawing. Then he handed the hat back to Annie. She took it with both hands, carefully, as if receiving back a piece of her soul. Then she placed it on her head. The woman at the desk stepped closer. Mr. Whitmore, what would you like me to do? Richard did not look away from Annie. Check her in. The woman blinked. You still want her admitted? She is a finalist, isn't she? Yes, but... Then check her in. Her face tightened, but she reached for the tablet. Annie Carter, finalist number 17. Grace went to get her badge. Richard turned to the guard. Make sure her portfolio is taped properly. Use the strongest tape you have. Yes, sir. Annie looked from one person to another, still unsure whether this was help or another test. Sir, she said, I don't want an exception just because someone feels sorry for me. Richard's eyes dropped to the hat. This is not pity. Then what is it? He was silent for a moment. Then he answered, It is a correction. Grace clipped the badge onto Annie's rust-colored hoodie. There, finalist number 17. The woman at the desk forced a smile. Your assigned table is in the back row, near the supply room. Grace frowned at the seating chart. That is not the section for community design finalists. That is where we had space. Richard took the chart from the woman's hand. Move her to the front row. The woman froze. The front row is reserved for organizational partners. Move them down one spot. Mr. Whitmore. Now. And that was the end of it. Annie followed Grace into the exhibition hall, carrying her repaired portfolio and the folded model in her backpack. Grace led her to a front table and removed another school's name card. I'm truly sorry about what happened out there, Grace said. Annie set down her portfolio. It wasn't your fault. No, but I work here. That doesn't mean you have to carry it. Grace paused, then smiled gently. Your mother raised you well. My father did too, Annie replied. She opened her backpack and took out the folded model. Foam board walls, a cardboard roof, tiny craft stick chairs, paper trees, and a courtyard floor wrapped in tissue paper. Grace watched her assemble it. You designed it so you could carry it on public transportation? Annie nodded. My father taught me that if something only works when everything is perfect, then it doesn't really work. Behind them, Richard stood silently at the entrance. He watched Annie put the little building together piece by piece. He should have been thinking about donors, cameras, judges, and the schedule, but only one name remained in his mind. Marcus Carter. That old hat felt as if it had been pulled out of the past and placed in the middle of his polished building. The competition hall slowly filled as the morning moved forward. Parents found seats near the back. Sponsors gathered around the coffee station beside the stage. Staff checked microphones, adjusted banners, tested projectors. At the front tables, Annie sat behind table 17, fitting the last paper tree into the courtyard of her model. Future blocks. The small community center stood no taller than her forearm. The roof panels lifted off to reveal reading rooms and workshop spaces inside. The porch wrapped around the front because her father had insisted years ago that every building needed somewhere people could sit without being rushed away. Grace stood beside her, studying the model again. You built all of this by hand? Annie nodded while pressing a tiny bench into place. Most of it. The windows are clear plastic from old packaging. The roof frame came from popsicle sticks. Grace smiled. You're kidding. My mother saved them for me in a coffee tin. Grace crouched lower. How long did this take? About 6 months. 6 months? I worked after school. Grocery store shifts ended around 8. Then I worked at home. Grace looked at her quietly. You did all this after work? Annie shrugged. I didn't really have another option. Across the hall, a group from Westbrook Academy unloaded a polished model from a hard case. Their structure had lights, moving parts, and a digital screen built into the base. Parents gathered around it taking pictures. One of the boys glanced toward Annie's table. That's the construction girl, he said quietly. The girl beside him followed his gaze. Front row? Seriously? She wasn't there 10 minutes ago. Their advisor lowered her voice. Focus on your own project. But they kept looking. Annie pretended not to notice. She had practiced doing that. Grace noticed anyway. You okay? I'm Feeney. You don't sound fine. Annie placed a miniature tree into the courtyard. People always think poor means incapable. You get used to it. Grace leaned against the table. No. You survive it. Different thing. Annie looked up. Grace smiled slightly. My mother cleaned hotel rooms for 19 years. Every time somebody called her uneducated, she'd come home and help me with calculus. That surprised a laugh out of Annie. There it is, Grace said. First smile all morning. At the far end of the hall, Richard Whitmore stood near the judges' area pretending to review schedules. He had not looked at the schedule in 15 minutes. Marcus Carter. The name kept returning. He walked toward the side hallway where staff records and event archives were stored. The registration woman hurried after him. Mr. Whitmore, the city council members arrive in 20 minutes. I know. You're opening the ceremony. I know. She hesitated. Was there a problem with the finalist placement? Richard stopped walking. Do we keep application essays? Yes. Get me Annie Carter's. The woman blinked. Now? Yes. She stared another second before nodding and disappearing toward the admin office. Richard stepped into the quieter hallway. Framed photographs lined the walls. Scholarship winners. Groundbreakings. Ribbon cuttings. Halfway down the corridor hung an old photo from the foundation's early years. Richard, at 32. Hard hat. Construction project. He slowed. The image hit him oddly. Not because of himself. Because the hard hat looked familiar. Back in the hall, Annie opened her backpack and removed a folded sheet of paper. The edges were worn from being opened too many times. Grace noticed. What's that? Annie looked down. My dad's handwriting. You bring it everywhere? Only important places. Grace sat beside her. Annie unfolded the page. The paper was yellowing at the corners. The writing slanted slightly to the right. If a building only serves people with money, it isn't a community building. It's decoration. Grace read quietly. He wrote this? Annie nodded. He used to leave notes in my sketchbooks. She smiled faintly. Sometimes on grocery receipts. Grace looked toward the cap on the table. He sounds like somebody worth remembering. Annie's hand rested beside the note. He was. The room quieted briefly as the audio system crackled to life. Finalists, first presentations begin in 30 minutes. Students shifted into motion. Boards straightened. Laptops opened. Parents took their seats. Annie folded the note and slipped it back into her backpack. At that moment, the registration woman entered the hall carrying a folder. She crossed directly to Richard. I found her application. Richard opened it. At the top, Annie Carter, A. Eton, Project, Future Blocks, Community Learning Center. Below it sat her essay. The first line stopped him. My father built schools he could never afford to send his daughter to. Richard read on. My father was Marcus Carter. He spent 30 years building places for other families. He believed buildings should protect dignity, not just weather. Richard lowered the paper. Marcus Carter, builder, Georgia, community projects. Something old moved behind his ribs. Not memory yet, just pressure. The registration woman watched him carefully. Do you know the family? Richard kept reading. Near the bottom, Annie had written, My father passed away 2 years ago. I wear his construction cap because I want him with me when I present this design. Richard looked toward table 17. Annie sat bent over her model, adjusting one of the paper benches. Grace stood beside her, holding extra tape. The old cap rested low over Annie's forehead. Richard stared longer than he meant to. The registration woman followed his gaze. She still doesn't really fit the event image, she said quietly. Richard folded the essay. No, he said. The woman nodded as though he agreed. Then Richard added, She fits the reason we created it. The woman looked at him, surprised. At table 17, Annie finally placed the last bench into the courtyard. She sat back. For the first time all morning, the model was complete. She touched the edge of the porch and whispered so softly only she could hear it. We made it, Dad. Across the room, Richard Whitmore still held the application. And for reasons he could not explain yet, he suddenly wanted to know everything about Marcus Carter. The first round of presentations began at 10 o'clock. 3 judges took their seats at the front of the hall. One was a university dean from Georgia Tech. One ran an urban planning nonprofit. The third was an architect, whose firm designed schools across the Southeast. Parents settled into rows behind them. Cameras adjusted. The room quieted. Richard Whitmore stepped onto the stage. The applause came automatically. He thanked donors, spoke about innovation, opportunity, and building stronger communities. He had given versions of this speech for years. Usually he could deliver it while thinking about something else. Today he kept seeing a worn construction cap. And the future, Richard said, finishing his remarks, belongs to people willing to build it. His eyes moved to table 17. Annie sat still behind her model. The cap remained on her head. Richard stepped away from the microphone. The presentations began. Westbrook Academy went first. Their project displayed animated traffic systems and smart energy blocks. The audience nodded. Parents recorded videos. Second came a private STEM school from Savannah. Then another. Grace stood near the side aisle with a clipboard while finalists rotated. Annie checked her badge again. Finalist 17. Her hands had become cold. Grace noticed immediately. How long until you present? 20 minutes. You nervous? Yes. Good. Annie looked up. Grace smiled. Means you care. At the judges' table, Richard sat with Annie's application still folded beside his notes. The architect judge leaned over. Interesting group this year. Richard nodded absently. The man followed his gaze toward Annie. You know that student? No. The answer came too quickly. The judge looked at the cap. Brave kid. Walking in here dressed like that. Richard's expression tightened. She qualified. I didn't say she didn't. Richard said nothing else. Across the room, a girl from Westbrook passed Annie's table while carrying her display board. She slowed. So you're the construction hat girl. Annie looked up. The girl smiled politely enough to avoid trouble. Your project actually looks nice. I just didn't expect. Her eyes moved to the cap. That, my dad's hat. Oh, the girl shifted awkwardly. My grandfather was a builder, Annie added. He used to wear one too. The girl nodded and walked away. Grace leaned closer. You handled that better than I would. I've had practice. The next finalist was called. Then another. The room moved forward. Annie felt herself moving backward. Her eyes dropped to the folded paper in her backpack. The note. Her father's handwriting. She opened it beneath the table. If a building only serves people with money, it isn't a community building. It's decoration. Her fingers rested on the page. Suddenly she was 12 again. Summer heat. Her father kneeling beside a stack of lumber in a school gym under renovation. See that wall? Marcus had asked. Young Annie nodded. Most people think construction means putting things up. He handed her a tape measure. Wrong. Construction is deciding who matters enough to build for. What if nobody builds for us? Marcus smiled. Then we learn to build ourselves. Finalist 17. The voice from the stage pulled her back. Grace touched her shoulder. That's you. The room blurred for half a second. Annie stood. She adjusted the cap, picked up the model, walked toward the stage. Richard looked up. The hall quieted again. Annie placed future blocks onto the presentation table. Under the lights, the little community center looked smaller than before. Her throat tightened. The dean smiled politely. Whenever you're ready. Annie looked at the audience. Rows of strangers. Parents. Judges. Richard. Then she looked at the model. My project is called Future Blocks. She began quietly. A microphone carried her voice farther than she expected. It's a community learning center designed for working families. The screen behind her displayed the courtyard, library, workshop, porch, outdoor stage, tool room, reading garden. The architect judge leaned forward. Annie continued, there are evening hours because many parents work shifts. She pointed to the side entrance. This entrance stays open after school hours for adults taking classes. The nonprofit director nodded. The workshop teaches repair skills, woodworking basics, and tool safety. One parent in the audience lowered her phone and started listening. The courtyard can be seen from every room, Annie said. Parents can watch younger children while studying or attending classes. She paused. Her eyes moved to the porch. My father was a builder. The room went still. He built schools my family couldn't afford, apartments we couldn't rent, churches where he never sat in the front pew. Richard's hand stopped moving. Annie looked at the model. He used to say every building needs a place where people can sit without buying anything. She touched the porch. That's why this is here. Silence. The dean folded his hands. The architect stopped writing. My dad died 2 years ago, Annie swallowed. This project started as his idea. The room remained quiet. Richard looked down at her application again. Marcus Carter, builder, Georgia. The pressure inside his chest returned. Then Annie said the sentence that made him look up immediately. He spent years working construction across Georgia, sometimes around Macon when jobs moved south. Richard went still. Macon. The word landed differently. Not memory yet. Closer. The image came fast and incomplete. July heat. Stacks of concrete block. A pickup truck. Someone laughing. Someone handing him water. The vision disappeared before he could hold it. Mr. Whitmore? The architect beside him frowned. Richard realized everyone had turned toward him. He had gripped the edge of the table without noticing. You all right? Richard released his hand. Yes, but his voice sounded distant even to himself. On stage, Annie finished. I built this because neighborhoods shouldn't only survive. She looked at the audience. They should belong to the people living in them. No one spoke for a second. Then applause began, small at first, then larger. Grace smiled from the aisle. Annie stepped back from the podium. Her hands were shaking. She reached for the brim of her father's cap. At the judges' table, Richard Whitmore had stopped hearing the applause, because for the first time all morning, he was no longer trying to remember Marcus Carter. He was starting to remember him. Applause followed Annie as she carried the model back to table 17. Not everyone clapped. Some students returned to their notes immediately. A few parents nodded politely and looked back at the schedule. But others kept watching the girl in the construction cap walking carefully with her cardboard community center as though it were something breakable. Grace met her halfway. You did it. Annie set the model down. I forgot half of what I wanted to say. No, you didn't. I skipped the tool library section. Grace laughed. Nobody died. Annie let out a breath. It almost sounded like relief. Across the hall, Richard remained seated. The judges had already moved to comments on the next finalist, but he had stopped listening again. Macon, the word kept pulling at him. Summer heat, concrete dust, a pickup truck, someone sitting on stacked lumber. The image sharpened. He saw hands first. Dark hands, rough from work, holding out a wrapped sandwich. Richard stood abruptly. The architect judge looked over. "You all right? I need a minute." He left before anyone answered. The side hallway felt colder. Richard loosened his tie and stopped beside the old framed construction photo again. 32 years old. Hard hat. Groundbreaking ceremony. He stared at the picture. Then another memory hit. Not a ceremony. A construction site. He was 20. Contractor gone. Payroll gone. 3 weeks unpaid. Men shouting. Someone kicking over a bucket. Richard standing beside a pickup truck trying to count the money left in his pocket. $2. Maybe less. Then a voice. "You eaten today?" Richard closed his eyes. He knew that voice. Back in the hall, presentations continued. Annie sat behind her table, twisting the edge of the note her father had written years earlier. Grace handed her a bottle of water. "You should drink." Annie took it. "Thanks. You know the judges liked you, right?" Annie shook her head immediately. Grace smiled. The architect stopped taking notes halfway through because he was listening. "That's good? That's very good." Annie looked toward the stage. Richard's chair sat empty. "Where'd he go?" Grace followed her eyes. "Mr. Whitmore?" "Yeah. No idea." At that moment, the registration woman appeared beside table 17 holding a tablet. "Miss Carter." Annie looked up. "Mr. Whitmore wants a copy of your application essay." Annie blinked. "My essay?" "Yes." Grace frowned. "Why?" The woman shrugged. "He asked for it." Annie reached into her portfolio and handed over the extra copy she carried. The woman glanced at the title page. Future Blocks Community Learning Center. Applicant, Annie Carter. Parent inspiration, Marcus Carter. Her eyes paused on the name. "You really built all this because of your dad?" Annie nodded. The woman looked at the cap. Her voice softened slightly for the first time that day. "He must have been special." "He was." The woman walked away. Grace noticed Annie staring after her. "What?" She called him special. Grace smiled. People change when they hear stories. Across the hallway, Richard stood motionless. The memory finally opened. Macon, 1994. Half-finished strip mall outside town. Richard sleeping in his truck because rent was gone. Contractor disappeared with payroll. 3 days living on vending machine crackers. A man in a construction cap sitting beside him during lunch break. "Kid, you keep working like that and you're gonna pass out." Richard had laughed bitterly. "Can't pass out if nobody notices." The man handed him half a sandwich. "You got family?" Richard shook his head. "Then sit with mine tonight." Richard opened his eyes. Marcus. The name arrived fully now. Marcus Carter. Builder. Always carried extra food. Drove an old blue pickup. Laughed from his chest and wore the same kind of cap. Richard leaned against the wall. For 30 years he had told people he built everything alone. He suddenly was not sure that had ever been true. Someone knocked lightly. It was Grace. "Mr. Whitmore?" He straightened immediately. "Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt." "What is it?" "The finalists are moving to judge interviews." Richard nodded. Grace hesitated. "Can I ask something?" He looked at her. "Why did you change your mind about Annie?" The hallway grew quiet. Richard looked toward the hall where Annie sat adjusting one of the tiny paper trees on her model. "I remembered something," he said. Grace waited. He did not continue. She nodded once and started to leave. "Grace." She turned. "Get me information on Marcus Carter." Grace frowned slightly. "Annie's father?" "Yes." "What kind of information?" "Everything." Grace looked surprised. Then she nodded. Back in the hall, Annie sat alone now. Students had moved toward the interview stations. She stayed behind for a minute, resting both hands beside the model. Her eyes drifted toward the porch section, the tiny benches, the open space, the place where people could sit without buying anything. Her father's place. She touched the edge of the roof. "I wish you were here," she whispered. A shadow stopped beside the table. Annie looked up. Richard Whitmore stood there. For the first time since morning, there was no audience around him. No donors, no staff, just him. His eyes moved from the model to the cap, then back to Annie. "Your father, he said quietly. Did he ever work near Macon in the 90s? Annie looked surprised. Yes. Richard stood very still. He ever mention a young guy named Richard? He asked. Annie shook her head slowly. No. Why? Richard looked down at the small wooden porch on the model. For several seconds he did not answer. Then he asked softly, Did your father ever keep old photographs? Annie looked at Richard for a moment before answering. My dad kept everything. Richard stayed where he was. Photos? Boxes of them. Annie smiled faintly. My mom keeps saying she'll organize them. She never does. What kind of photos? Job sites mostly. People he worked with. Buildings. Old trucks. Crew cookouts. She paused. Why? Richard looked toward the stage where another finalist had started presenting. Applause rose briefly, then faded. I knew people in construction years ago, he said. Might have crossed paths. Annie nodded, though the answer felt smaller than the question. Grace appeared beside them carrying a clipboard. Judge interviews start in 5 minutes. Richard stepped back. Go. Annie gathered her papers. Before leaving, she glanced once at him. You really think you knew him? Richard looked at the cap. Maybe. It was not enough of an answer, but it was all he had. The interview stations had been arranged along the far side of the hall. Each finalist sat with a panel member for 10 minutes. Annie's first interview was with the architect. He studied the model quietly before looking up. Who taught you scale work? My father. Architect? Builder. The architect smiled. That explains the porch. Annie blinked. He tapped the drawing. Students your age usually design for impact. You designed for use. Annie thought about her father sitting on overturned buckets during lunch breaks. He said buildings should feel like people were expected. The architect wrote something down. Across the hall, Richard sat alone at the judge's table with Annie's application open again. Grace approached carrying a thin folder. You asked about Marcus Carter. Richard looked up immediately. That was fast. Grace sat beside him. Public records mostly. Construction licenses. Local projects. A few community mentions. Richard opened the folder. Marcus Carter. Construction foreman. Volunteer projects. Community rebuild programs? One newspaper clipping had a photo. Richard stopped breathing. The image was old and grainy. A group of workers stood outside a rebuilt youth center. Front row. A younger Marcus. Construction cap. Smile wide. And beside him, Richard closed the folder. Grace noticed. You know him. It was not a question. Richard looked toward Annie again. She sat across from the architect now, explaining the workshop area in her design with both hands moving as she spoke. She was right, he said quietly. About what? He was special. Grace remained silent. Richard leaned back. Memory no longer came in pieces. It came whole. Sama, etusine anihundre afirio helfims. Heat pressing down over unfinished concrete. A contractor gone with payroll money. Young Richard sleeping in his truck outside Macon because he had nowhere else to go. Marcus finding him there. You got someplace to stay tonight? Richard shaking his head. Marcus tossing him keys. Then you got my couch. Grace's voice pulled him back. What happened? Richard looked at her. I owe him. Grace frowned. Marcus? Richard nodded once. How much? Richard looked toward Annie. More than she knows. At the interview station, Annie finished with the architect and moved to the nonprofit director. The woman adjusted her glasses. Your project focuses heavily on working families. Yes. Why not children only? Annie thought for a second. Because kids go home. The woman looked up. Annie continued. If parents are exhausted, children carry it. If adults don't have places to learn, rest, repair things, meet neighbors, the kids feel it anyway. The woman smiled slightly. You sound older than 18. My mother says that too. Your mother works? Night shift nurse. The woman nodded slowly and wrote another note. At the judge's table, Richard opened the folder again. Another clipping. Volunteer rebuild after a church fire. Marcus Carter organizing crews. No payment. Weekend project. Richard remembered that too. Marcus working 6 days and spending Sunday rebuilding somebody else's wall. You ever rest? Richard had asked once. Marcus laughed. Rest is expensive when people need help. Richard closed his eyes briefly. For years, people had asked him where his drive came from. He always answered the same way. Hunger. He had never said the second part. The people who fed him. A movement at table 17 caught his eye. Annie had returned. She sat alone now. The hall had grown louder as interviews continued. She removed the folded note from her backpack again. Richard watched her smooth the paper flat with both hands. Then she placed it beside the model. Grace looked over. "What is she doing?" Richard's voice softened, keeping him close. At that moment, Annie's phone vibrated. "Mum." She answered immediately. "Hey." Lena Carter sounded tired. "How's it going?" Annie looked around the hall. "I think okay." "You eat yet?" Annie smiled despite herself. "No. Of course not." Her mother sighed. "There's meatloaf in the fridge when you get home." Annie looked at the model. "Mom." "Yeah? I think Dad would have liked this place." Silence. Then softly, "He already did." Annie lowered her eyes. Across the hall, Richard turned away. The conversation had reached him even from a distance. He looked down at Marcus's file again, then at the cap, then at Annie. For the first time since morning, guilt settled in properly. Not because he had almost thrown her out, because he had forgotten the man who once refused to throw him away. At the front of the hall, a staff member stepped to the microphone. "Finalists. Preliminary results will be announced in 1 hour." Students straightened. Parents looked up. Excitement moved through the room. Annie folded her father's note carefully and returned it to her bag. She had no idea that while everyone else waited for scores and rankings, Richard Whitmore had already begun measuring something else entirely. Debt. The hour passed slower for Annie than the whole morning before it. Students gathered in clusters near their tables, pretending not to watch the clock. Parents drifted toward the coffee station. Staff adjusted chairs in front of the stage where preliminary results would be announced. Grace returned carrying 2 paper plates. "I brought food." Annie looked up. Turkey sandwich, chips, apple slices. Grace set 1 plate down. "Before you tell me you're not hungry, I already decided you are." Annie smiled faintly. "You do this for everyone?" "No. Most finalists have parents feeding them." Annie looked around. Westbrook Academy had 3 parents at their table. Another student stood with grandparents taking photos. Table 17 had Grace. And a paper plate. "Thanks," Annie said quietly. Grace sat beside her. "You called your mom?" "Yeah." "How is she?" "Tired." Grace nodded like she understood that answer better than most. "My mom used to come home from hotel shifts and fall asleep in the recliner before dinner." Annie looked at her. "She still does," Grace added. They laughed softly. Across the hall, Richard remained seated at the judge's table with Marcus Carter's file open beside him. He had not touched his lunch. The registration woman noticed when she passed. "You should eat." Richard closed the folder. "Did Marcus Carter ever come through our programs?" She frowned. "You mean the foundation? Any volunteer events? Construction projects?" She thought a moment. "I don't know. Find out." She hesitated. "Mr. Whitmore, can I ask something?" He looked up. "What happened this morning? You almost removed that girl from the building. Now you're moving her table, reading her essays, asking for files." Richard looked toward Annie. "She reminded me of someone." The woman followed his eyes. "Her father?" Richard did not answer. On stage, a staff member tested the microphone. "Finalists, please take your seats." The room shifted. Students moved forward. Annie straightened the brim of the cap. Grace squeezed her shoulder once. "No matter what happens, you belonged here." Annie nodded. The preliminary board appeared on the large screen. Top 5 finalists advanced to the final review. The first name appeared. Westbrook Academy. Applause. Second, Savannah STEM Institute. Third, Northridge Charter. Fourth, another private school. Annie felt her stomach drop. Only 1 spot left. Grace looked toward her. Annie kept her face still. The 5th name appeared. Not Annie Carter. Silence settled around table 17. The room clapped politely. Students hugged parents. Phones came out. Across the hall, Richard looked at the screen once, then immediately at Annie. She did not cry. That almost made it worse. Grace leaned down. "Annie, it's okay." It was not okay. Annie stood. She picked up the folded note from her father and slid it back into her backpack. Her movements were careful, almost too careful. The way people move when holding themselves together takes effort. Grace watched. "You should stay. There's networking after this." Annie shook her head. "My bus leaves in an hour." At the judge's table, the architect frowned at the ranking sheet. He turned toward Richard. "Question." Richard looked over. "How did Future Blocks miss top 5? The nonprofit director nodded immediately. "I had her in my top group." "So did I." the architect said. Richard reached for the score sheets. Future blocks. Strong community value. Practical design. Excellent social impact. Then one low score. Technical innovation. Below average. The score belonged to the university dean. Richard looked toward him. The dean adjusted his papers. Good project, he said calmly, but not visionary enough. Richard closed the sheet. Across the hall, Annie had already packed half the model. The little paper trees went into the box first. Then the porch. Always the porch. Richard stood. The architect looked up. Where are you going? Richard did not answer. At table 17, Annie wrapped the roof pieces in tissue paper. Grace stood beside her. You really leaving? Annie nodded. My mom gets off at 6. You can wait for final announcements. I wasn't invited to finals. Grace opened her mouth, then stopped, because Richard Whitmore had arrived. Annie looked up. He glanced at the packed model. You're leaving? Yes, sir. Why? Annie almost smiled at the question. Because I lost. Richard looked at the model. No. Annie frowned slightly. The ranking says otherwise. Richard pulled a chair and sat across from her. Grace stepped back. The room had become loud again, but table 17 suddenly felt separate from it. Richard placed the score sheet on the table. 3 judges scored you near the top. Annie looked down. 1 didn't. That happens. She nodded. My dad used to say buildings don't get finished because everybody agrees. Richard almost smiled. He sounds like he said a lot of things. He did. Richard looked at the cap, then at the model, then at Annie. What are you doing after this competition? She shrugged. Community college, maybe. Depends on money. Architecture school? I can't afford architecture school. The answer came too fast, like she had already practiced accepting it. Richard leaned back. 30 years ago, Marcus Carter had handed a hungry young laborer half a sandwich because he saw someone worth feeding. Today, that man's daughter sat across from him packing away her future because she thought she could not afford to keep it. The dead inside Richard shifted again. Not memory now. Responsibility. Grace watched his face change. Mr. Whitmore? Richard stood. Don't pack the model yet. Annie looked up. Why? Richard turned toward the stage where finalists celebrated, then back to her. Because this competition isn't finished. Grace stared. Annie blinked. On stage, the microphone crackled again. Attention finalists and guests. The voice paused. Richard Whitmore was already walking toward the front. The room quieted as Richard Whitmore walked onto the stage again. People assumed it was part of the schedule. Parents sat back down. Students stopped gathering their things. The 5 finalists exchanged quick looks, expecting another speech before the networking session. Annie remained beside table 17 with one hand resting on the model box. Grace stood next to her. What's happening? Annie shook her head. I don't know. Richard reached the microphone. The staff member stepped aside immediately. He looked out across the hall. His eyes moved over donors, judges, parents, finalists. Then to Annie. We've announced the preliminary finalists, he said, but I reviewed something today that deserves another conversation. The room grew still. At the judges' table, the university dean shifted in his seat. Richard continued. This competition exists because talent does not always arrive dressed the same way, raised the same way, or funded the same way. The registration woman slowly looked up. Grace crossed her arms. Annie stood motionless. Richard glanced at the score sheets in his hand. One project was ranked lower for innovation. The architect judge leaned back. The dean looked toward him. Richard lifted the paper. Future blocks. Whispers moved across the room. Annie's fingers tightened around the model box. Richard looked at the audience. A learning center with evening access for working families. Shared spaces. Repair workshops. Open courtyards. A place where parents and children both belong. He paused. That is not a lack of vision. Silence. The nonprofit judge nodded first. Then the architect. The dean folded his hands. Richard stepped away from the microphone. Not toward the finalists. Toward table 17. Every eye in the room followed him. Annie looked up as he stopped beside her model. He touched the small wooden porch. You said your father believed people should have somewhere to sit without buying anything. Annie nodded. He did. Richard looked at the tiny benches. So did someone I used to know. Grace watched him carefully. Richard turned toward the audience again. When I was 20, I worked construction outside Macon. The hall quieted further. I was broke, angry, sleeping in my truck after a contractor disappeared with our pay. The registration woman stared. The donors stopped talking. Richard never spoke publicly about those years. Someone helped me, he continued. A builder. Annie slowly lifted her eyes. Richard looked at the cap. He gave me food when I didn't ask, work when I didn't deserve trust, a place to sleep when I had nowhere to go. The pressure in Annie's chest changed. Grace looked between them. Richard faced Annie fully now. What was your father's favorite truck? The question caught her off guard. What? The truck he drove. Annie blinked. Blue pickup. Old Ford. Richard closed his eyes briefly. Blue pickup. There it was. Whole now. Marcus leaning against the hood, laughing, throwing him keys. Sleep on the couch, kid. Truck ain't comfortable enough for heartbreak. Richard opened his eyes. The room waited. Annie spoke quietly. You knew him. It was not a question anymore. Richard nodded once. Yes. The word passed through the hall like wind. Annie stared at him. My father never mentioned you. He wouldn't. Richard looked down. I left. Grace watched Annie's face. Confusion. Curiosity. Something else. Richard straightened. This competition was built to create opportunities. He looked around the room. Today I almost threw one out the front door. Nobody moved. The registration woman lowered her eyes. The older security guard near the entrance looked away. Richard continued. I saw a girl in work boots and a construction cap and decided she didn't belong. His voice remained even, but lower now. I was wrong. Annie stood completely still. The 5 finalists on stage no longer looked comfortable. Richard turned toward the judge's table. I'm exercising founder discretion. The dean frowned. Richard. He lifted a hand. Future blocks advances. The room erupted. Parents whispered. Students turned. Grace grabbed Annie's arm. Annie herself did not move. You're in, Grace whispered. Annie looked at Richard. He had not taken his eyes off her. The dean stood. We already announced results. Richard nodded. And now we're announcing one more. The architect judge smiled openly. The nonprofit director clapped first. Others followed. Annie still did not react. Richard stepped closer. Miss Carter. Her eyes finally focused. Don't pack the model. The words landed differently this time. Not a request. Not pity. Permission. Annie looked down at the little building. The porch. The trees. The note folded in her bag. Then back at Richard. My dad helped you? Richard answered quietly. He helped build the life I forgot I borrowed. The room had gone silent again. Annie's throat tightened. Grace squeezed her shoulder. Richard looked once more at the cap. For the first time all day, he no longer saw an old construction hat. He saw Marcus. And for the first time since entering the hall, Annie no longer looked at Richard Whitmore as the man who tried to throw her out. She looked at him as someone carrying part of her father's past. On stage, the microphone crackled again. Final review presentations will begin in 30 minutes. Students returned to motion. Parents stood. Conversations resumed. But table 17 stayed still, because the competition had changed, and so had the people inside it. The hall never fully recovered after Richard's announcement. People tried. Parents returned to their seats. Staff rearranged schedules. The finalists gathered near the stage for the final review briefing, but conversations had changed direction. Everyone was talking about table 17. Annie stood beside her model while Grace replaced her finalist card with a new one. Final review. Annie read the words twice. I still don't understand what happened. Grace clipped the card onto the stand. Neither do I. You think he really knew my dad? Grace looked toward Richard. He stood near the judge's table speaking with the architect, but his eyes kept drifting back toward Annie. Yes, Grace said quietly. I think he did. At the front row, the 5 original finalists had become 6. Westbrook Academy's lead student, Tyler Bennett, folded his arms. This is ridiculous. The girl beside him lowered her voice. Tyler, no, seriously. We all followed the process. Annie heard him. She pretended she did not. Tyler looked directly at the cap. She loses, gets a speech, and suddenly she's back in? Grace straightened immediately. Careful. Tyler shrugged. I'm saying what everyone's thinking. No, Grace replied. You're saying what you're thinking. Tyler opened his mouth again but stopped when Richard walked over. The silence came instantly. Richard looked at Tyler. Problem? Tyler shifted. No, sir. Richard nodded once. Then he turned to Annie. Walk with me. Grace raised an eyebrow at Annie. Annie looked just as confused. Richard led her out through the side corridor toward the foundation courtyard. The noise of the event faded behind them. Outside, the space opened into a small brick patio with benches and young maple trees. Annie stopped beside the railing. Richard remained standing. For a few seconds, neither spoke. Finally, Annie asked, "Why did you help me?" Richard looked at the trees. "Because I should have helped sooner." "That's not really an answer." "No." He sat on one of the benches. "Your father worked with me one summer." Annie stayed standing. "I wasn't anybody then," Richard said. "Just another laborer. My dad never talked much about work. He talked enough for everyone." That surprised a small smile from Annie. Richard noticed. He used to carry extra lunches. Annie laughed softly now. "Mom hated that." Richard looked at her. "She still does?" "Yeah. She'd pack him food and he'd come home with an empty cooler because he gave half of it away." Richard lowered his eyes. "That sounds right." The courtyard grew quiet. A breeze moved the leaves overhead. Annie sat on the opposite bench. "You said he helped build your life." Richard nodded. "My contractor disappeared with payroll money." He looked toward the brick path. "I had nowhere to go." Annie listened. "Your father found me sleeping in my truck." Her expression changed. "He brought me home." Annie blinked. Richard smiled once. "Tired and small. Your mother made meatloaf." "Anya staret." "How do you know that?" "Because I ate 3 plates." She laughed before she could stop herself. "My mom still makes meatloaf." Richard looked at her. "She still overcooks the edges?" Annie slowly stopped smiling. "How do you know that?" Richard leaned back. "Because your father complained every single time and still asked for seconds." For a moment, neither moved. The distance between billionaire and student seemed to shift. Annie looked at the cap. "My dad really talked to you?" "All the time." Richard smiled faintly. Couldn't stop him. "What did he say?" Richard looked toward the sky. "He said people think construction is about buildings." His voice lowered. "He said it was really about protecting people from weather and loneliness." Annie froze. That sentence. Her father had said it to her too. Many times. She lowered her eyes. "He used to tell me that." "I know." Silence settled again. Inside the hall, applause drifted through the glass doors. Final review preparations had started. Annie looked at Richard. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" He thought for a moment. "Because I wasn't sure I deserved to." Annie frowned. "You didn't do anything." Richard looked at her directly now. "I almost threw his daughter out of the building." The words stayed between them. Annie looked down. "You didn't know." "I should have known better anyway." She said nothing. Richard stood. "I spent 30 years telling people I built everything myself." He looked toward the hall. "Turns out I borrowed more than I admitted." Annie followed his gaze. The competition waited inside. The scholarship, the finals, her future. Richard checked his watch. "We should go back." Annie stood too. Before they reached the door, she stopped. "Mr. Whitmore?" He turned. "If my dad were here," she hesitated, "he probably would have forgiven you already." Richard looked at the cap. The old construction hat sat slightly crooked on her head the way workers wore them after long hours. He smiled faintly. "Your father was a better man than me." Annie shook her head. "No." Richard looked at her. "He just got there first." For the first time that day, Richard laughed. Not the cold laugh from the lobby. A real one. Inside the hall, Grace saw them returning and blinked. Annie was smiling. Richard Whitmore was too. Grace looked toward table 17. Then toward the final stage. Whatever had started with an old construction cap that morning was no longer about a competition. And everyone was beginning to feel it. When Annie and Richard returned to the hall, final review tables had already been rearranged. The 6 finalists sat in a semicircle facing the judges. Parents filled the back rows again. Staff moved quietly between cameras and microphones. Grace looked up the moment Annie entered. "You okay?" Annie nodded. Grace studied her face for another second. The tension from earlier had eased. Not gone. Just lighter. Richard returned to the judges' area. The university dean leaned toward him immediately. "You changed the structure of the competition." Richard sat down. "I corrected it." The dean lowered his voice. "You're getting emotionally involved." Richard looked toward table 17. Annie was adjusting the paper porch on her model again. "Maybe," he said. The final review began with open questions. Students presented practical budgets, sustainability plans, future scalability. Tyler Bennett from Westbrook stood beside his digital display. Our proposal integrates AI traffic systems with adaptive zoning. The judges nodded. Strong project. Polished. Professional. Then came Annie. She carried future blocks to the center table. The cap stayed on. Tyler looked away immediately. The architect judge smiled. Miss Carter, final question. Annie nodded. If someone gave you money tomorrow, what would you build first? The room quieted. Annie looked at the model. The porch. A few people smiled. The architect did not. Why? Because people need somewhere to belong before they need classrooms. Silence. Annie touched the front edge of the model. My dad used to come home exhausted. Sometimes he sat outside before entering the house. Grace lowered her clipboard. He said construction workers spend all day building places for other people. Annie looked down. He needed somewhere built for him too. Richard looked away. The nonprofit judge asked gently, "And this building would do that?" Annie nodded. "It would try." The architect wrote nothing for several seconds. At the back row, Lena Carter entered quietly, still wearing hospital scrubs under her coat, hair tied back, exhaustion under her eyes. She had come straight from shift. Grace noticed first. Annie. Annie turned. Her face changed instantly. "Mom?" Lena smiled and lifted a paper bag. "I brought dinner." The room laughed softly. Annie left the table and hugged her. "You came. Wouldn't miss it." Lena looked around. "So this is the big future building place." Grace smiled. "You must be Annie's mom." Lena nodded. "And you must be the angel feeding my child." Grace laughed. Richard watched from the judge's table. Lena Carter. Time moved strangely for a second. Older now. Tired. But familiar. Meatloaf. Kitchen light. Marcus laughing beside her. Richard stood before he realized he had moved. The dean looked up. "Where are you going now?" Richard ignored him. He crossed the room. Lena turned as he approached. For a moment both simply looked. Then Richard said quietly, "Mrs. Carter?" Lena frowned. "Yes? You probably don't remember me." She studied him. Gray suit. Silver at the temples. Face older. Then her expression shifted. Small at first. Then all at once. "Richard?" Annie looked between them. Lena stared. "Oh my lord." The room disappeared around Richard. Lena laughed in disbelief. "Marcus used to call you the skinny kid." Several people nearby smiled. Annie blinked. "What?" Lena pointed at Richard. "You." Richard actually smiled. "Fair description." Lena shook her head slowly. "You vanished." "I know." Marcus wondered what happened to you. Richard lowered his eyes. "I kept meaning to come back." Lena looked at him for a long second. Then at the cap on Annie's head. "You recognized it?" Richard nodded. Annie stood frozen. "You really knew my parents." Lena laughed softly. "He practically lived in our house one summer." The hall had become silent again. Grace covered her mouth. Tyler stopped pretending not to listen. Lena looked at Annie. "Your father used to bring him home after work." Annie stared at Richard. "You ate our meatloaf?" Richard nodded once. Lena smiled. 3 servings every time. The room laughed. Richard shook his head. "I was hungry." "You were always hungry." Annie looked from one to the other. All day she had listened to fragments. Builder. Truck. Macon. Now the pieces stood in front of her wearing hospital scrubs and a billionaire suit. Grace whispered, "Wow." Lena turned toward the model. "This is the project?" Annie nodded. Lena touched the porch. "Your dad would have cried." Annie swallowed. Lena looked up at Richard. "He always said she'd build something one day." Richard stared at the model, then at Annie, the girl he had tried to remove that morning. Marcus's daughter, the child who had once sat at the kitchen table while he ate food her parents could barely spare. A staff member approached the stage. "Final scoring begins in 15 minutes. The room slowly moved again. People returned to seats. Judges gathered papers. Lena squeezed Annie's hand. "I brought meatloaf." Annie laughed through wet eyes. Grace looked at the bag. "Please tell me there's enough." Lena smiled. "There's always enough." Richard stood beside them a moment longer. 30 years ago, Marcus Carter had made room at his table for a hungry young laborer. Now his wife stood in the same building carrying dinner for everyone else. Richard felt the debt shift again. Not heavier, clearer, and for the first time all day, he stopped wondering whether Annie deserved to be here. The question had become whether the competition deserved her. Final scoring moved into a closed session. The judges gathered their sheets and stepped into the conference room beside the stage. Staff closed the doors behind them. The finalists were asked to wait in the hall. The tension changed again. Before, everyone had been competing. Now everyone was waiting. Lena opened the paper bag and placed containers on table 17. I brought extra. Grace looked inside. Mashed potatoes too? Lena smiled. Marcus always said meatloaf without potatoes was just sadness. Richard laughed quietly before he could stop himself. Lena pointed immediately. See? He remembers. Annie watched them both. It still felt strange. This man had nearly thrown her out 6 hours earlier. Now he stood beside her mother talking about dinner from 30 years ago. Grace handed Annie a fork. Eat. I'm not hungry. 3 voices answered at once. Yes, you are. Annie looked from Grace to her mother to Richard. Lena smiled. You see? Everybody knows. Annie sought. Richard remained standing until Lena looked at him. You too. He blinked. Mrs. Carter. Sit down, Richard. Grace hid a smile. Richard sat. The first bite stopped him. Lena noticed immediately. Still overcooked? He looked up. No. He swallowed. Still perfect. Lena shook her head. Marcus used to complain every time. Then eat half the pan, Richard said. They laughed. Annie watched quietly. She had never seen her mother laugh with someone from her father's past. Lena wiped her hands with a napkin. You know, Marcus kept talking about that summer for years. Richard looked up. I didn't know that. Oh yes, Lena smiled. He'd come home and say, that skinny kid's gonna do something big one day. Grace looked at Richard. He called it? Lena nodded. Marcus had a habit of seeing people before they saw themselves. Richard lowered his eyes. Annie touched the edge of her fork. My dad never told me any of this. Lena looked at her. He told me once not to. The table went quiet. What do you mean? Annie asked. Lena leaned back. After Richard left, I asked Marcus if he ever heard from him again. Richard looked up slowly. He said no. Lena smiled faintly. Then I asked why he kept saving newspaper articles whenever Richard's company made the news. Grace looked toward Richard. Lena continued. He said, because it's enough knowing he made it. Richard stared at the table. No one spoke. The noise of the hall seemed farther away. Annie looked at him. My dad kept your articles? Lena nodded. In a shoebox. Richard laughed once under his breath. A painful sound more than a happy one. A shoebox? Top shelf of the closet. Annie looked down. Her father had never thrown anything away. Old tape measures, broken pencils, ticket stubs, crew photos, and apparently newspaper articles about a man who had disappeared from their lives. Grace quietly pushed the potatoes toward Richard. You should eat more. He looked at her. You sound like Marcus. Lena smiled immediately. There it is. What? That face. She pointed at him. You're remembering. Richard leaned back. He was. Not just the hard times anymore. Sunday dinners. Marcus arguing about football. Annie as a little girl asleep on the couch with crayons beside her. The smell of sawdust coming in with work boots left by the door. A home. One he had borrowed and never returned to. The conference room door opened. The judges stepped out. The hall stood still. Finalists rose. Parents put down phones. Grace moved beside Annie. Lena squeezed her daughter's hand. The architect approached the stage. We're ready. Students gathered. Tyler stood with perfect posture. Annie adjusted the cap. Richard remained at table 17. The architect opened the envelope. Third place. Applause. Another name. Second place. More applause. Only 2 remained. Westbrook Academy. Future blocks. Annie's hand tightened around the brim. The architect looked down. Before he could speak, the university dean stood. Excuse me. The room froze. He walked to the microphone. I'd like to address something before first place is announced. Richard looked up. The dean held the score sheets. Founder discretion altered this competition. The room shifted. Tyler looked toward Annie. Grace straightened immediately. The dean continued. I believe all finalists deserve transparency. Richard stood. Lena frowned. The dean looked directly at Annie. Your project returned because Mr. Whitmore intervened. Silence. Parents exchanged looks. Students turned. Annie stayed still. Grace stepped forward. That isn't the whole story. The dean ignored her. The integrity of a competition matters. Richard walked toward the stage. David. The dean turned. No, Richard. We're saying this properly. Annie looked at the floor. The cap suddenly felt heavier. Tyler shifted awkwardly. Lena rose beside her daughter. Richard reached the stage. His voice stayed calm. You want transparency? The dean nodded. Richard took the microphone. Fine. The hall quieted. Richard looked at Annie, then at the room. I brought Future Blocks back because I recognized the name Marcus Carter. Silence. He was the man who kept me alive when I had nothing. Nobody moved. Richard continued. I almost removed his daughter from this building today. The room remained still, and correcting that mistake has nothing to do with favoritism. His eyes moved across the finalists. It has everything to do with justice. The words stayed in the air. Grace looked at Annie. Lena held her daughter's shoulder. Richard lowered the microphone. I did not give her a place. He looked at the model. She built it herself. No one spoke. At the front row, Tyler lowered his eyes. The architect opened the envelope again. The hall waited. Annie stood between her mother and the man her father had once fed. And for the first time that day, she understood something. Her father had never stopped building. He had just built people instead of walls. The hall stayed quiet after Richard stepped away from the microphone. Nobody hurried the moment. The judges remained seated. Parents watched without whispering. Even the finalists stood still. The architect looked down at the envelope again. First place, he said, goes to Westbrook Academy. Applause came. Tyler looked relieved more than happy. He walked to the stage, accepted the plaque, shook hands, posed for photos. Annie clapped too. Grace watched her carefully. You okay? Annie nodded. I knew I probably wouldn't win. That doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. Annie looked at the stage. Tyler stood with his team and the trophy. No, she said quietly. It still hurts. Lena slipped an arm around her shoulders. Richard remained near the front row. The competition should have been over. It was not. The architect returned to the microphone. Before we close. The room settled again. Richard looked up. The architect smiled slightly. The judges would like to recognize one additional project. The dean turned. The nonprofit director folded her hands. The architect continued. Future Blocks. Annie blinked. For outstanding community impact, practical design, and human-centered planning. Grace grabbed Annie's arm. The architect reached beneath the podium and lifted another folder. Miss Annie Carter, please come forward. The room applauded. Not loudly at first, then stronger. Lena smiled through tears. Annie stood without moving. Grace nudged her. Go. Annie walked toward the stage. The cap remained on. Richard watched every step. The architect handed her the certificate. Then the nonprofit director stepped beside him. We are also recommending Future Blocks for the Community Builders Initiative. Annie looked confused. What is that? The woman smiled. A development grant program. The room murmured. The architect continued. It includes mentorship and funding review. Grace whispered, Oh my God. Annie looked down at the paper in her hands. The words blurred slightly. Community Builders Initiative candidate. She looked toward her mother. Lena nodded immediately. Richard remained still. The nonprofit director looked at Annie. Your father built spaces. You designed one. Annie swallowed. Thank you. She stepped away from the stage. The applause faded. People began gathering bags. Parents moved toward exits. Students packed models. The long day had finally started ending. At table 17, Grace helped wrap the paper trees. Lena folded napkins into the empty food bag. Richard approached quietly. Lena looked up first. You stayed. He smiled faintly. Apparently. Annie set the certificate down. I didn't win. No, Richard said. She looked at him. But you were seen. The words stayed with her. Lena zipped the bag. We should get going. Bus won't wait. Annie nodded. She packed the porch last again. Always last. Richard watched. Mrs. Carter. Lena turned. Would you both stay a few minutes? Annie looked up. Lena frowned slightly. For what? Richard hesitated. Something I need to show you. Grace looked between them. What kind of something? Richard almost smiled. The old kind. 20 minutes later, the hall stood mostly empty. Tables had been cliched. Models packed. Staff folded banners. Richard led Annie and Lena down the side corridor toward the Foundation archives. Grace followed behind carrying the model box because she refused to let Annie carry everything alone. At the end of the corridor, Richard unlocked a storage room. Shelves lined the walls. Old files, framed photos, groundbreaking pictures, construction projects, scholarship ceremonies. Richard walked to a cabinet near the back. He opened a drawer, removed a thin envelope. The paper had yellowed. He handed it to Lena. Her face changed immediately. "Oh." Annie looked down. Inside was a photograph. Young Marcus stood beside an unfinished building wearing the same construction cap. Beside him stood a thin young laborer with sunburned arms. "Richard." Lena sat down slowly. "You kept this?" Richard nodded. "For 30 years. Annie held the picture with both hands. Her father looked younger than she had ever known him. Alive, laughing, one arm over Richard's shoulder. On the back, written in Marcus's handwriting, "Keep building. Better days are coming." Annie stopped breathing. Her fingers moved over the words. The same words sewn inside the cap. Lena wiped her eyes. "He put that on everything." Richard looked at the photograph. "He put it on me too." Silence filled the room. Grace stood near the shelves without speaking. Annie looked up. "My dad saved your newspaper articles." Richard nodded once. "I know now. You saved this." He looked at Marcus in the photo. "Yes." Annie lowered her eyes again. For the first time since her father died, she was holding an image of him she had never seen. Not as a father, not as a worker, as someone who changed another person's life. Lena touched the photo. "He would have loved today." Richard shook his head softly. "No." They looked at him. "He would have complained about the judges first." Lena laughed through tears. "Yes." He would have said the chairs were uncomfortable. "Yes." And he would have eaten all the meatloaf. Lena nodded again. Annie smiled despite herself. Richard looked at the cap, then at the photo, then at Annie. The dead inside him no longer felt hidden. It sat in the room with them. Visible. Named. Marcus Carter. Builder. Friend. The man who gave away food when he barely had enough himself. Outside the archive room, the foundation lights dimmed one row at a time. The day was ending, but something else had only just begun. The archive room stayed quiet long after the photograph had passed through everyone's hands. Lena sat with it on her lap. Annie kept looking at her father's face. Richard stood near the cabinet as though moving would break something. Grace finally cleared her throat. "So?" She looked at the picture again. "Your dad really did save everybody." Lena smiled faintly. "Marcus had a problem." Annie looked up. "He couldn't leave people alone." Richard laughed softly. "That's true." Lena nodded toward him. "You remember the church roof job?" Richard closed his eyes briefly. "Oh no." Grace looked interested immediately. "What happened?" Lena leaned back. "Marcus came home and said one of the workers had nowhere to stay." Richard rubbed his forehead. "Mrs. Carter?" "By Friday there were 3 of them eating dinner at our table." Grace laughed. Annie stared at Richard. "You lived with us?" "Temporarily." Lena smiled. 6 weeks is not temporary." Richard shook his head. "I paid rent." "You tried." The room laughed. Annie looked back at the photo. There was another man in the background she did not recognize. A truck. Stacks of lumber. Then something caught her eye. She turned the photo over again. Beneath the handwriting sat another line. "Macon Youth Learning Project. 1994. Annie frowned. "Dad built a learning center?" Lena leaned forward. "Oh." Richard looked over. "What?" Lena pointed at the words. "That project." The smile faded from her face. Annie looked between them. "What project?" Lena sat quietly for a second. "Marcus volunteered there." Richard nodded slowly. "The youth center. It burned, right?" Lena asked. Richard looked surprised. "You remember?" "Marcus talked about it for years." Grace pulled a chair closer. "What happened?" Richard took the photograph. The center had water damage and half the roof collapsed. His eyes stayed on the picture. "Nobody wanted to fund repairs." Lena nodded. "So the crew rebuilt it weekends." Annie looked at them. "My dad never told me." "He wouldn't," Lena said softly. "He didn't think helping people was a story." Richard looked toward Annie. That center mattered. "How?" He sat down. "There was a kid there." The room quieted. "He used the library every day. Stayed until closing because home wasn't safe." Annie listened. The center reopened. Richard paused. "That kid finished school." Grace frowned slightly. "You know what happened to him?" Richard nodded. "He runs a nonprofit now." Lena smiled. "Marcus would like that." Richard looked at the photo. "He already did." Silence settled again. Outside, someone rolled equipment carts down the hallway. The event was ending. Grace checked the time. "We should probably go before they lock us in with the archives." Lena stood slowly. Her shift had been over for hours. The exhaustion was back in her shoulders now. Annie packed the photograph carefully into the envelope. Richard noticed. Keep it. She looked up. What? It belongs with you. Annie held the envelope tighter. Are you sure? Richard nodded. I kept it long enough. Lena zipped the food bag. Grace lifted the model box. The little porch rattled softly inside. As they reached the door, Annie stopped. Mr. Whitmore? He turned. Did my dad know you'd become rich? Richard smiled faintly. The last time he saw me, I owned a truck that barely started. Lena laughed immediately. That awful thing. It had character. It had smoke. Grace smiled. Annie looked at Richard. Then how did he know? Richard frowned. Know what? That you'd do something big. The room grew still. Richard looked at the photograph again. Marcus's arm rested over his shoulder. Young, sunburned, hungry, alive. Then he remembered. A late evening. Work boots by the door. Marcus sitting on the porch. You think people stay poor because they're weak? Young Richard shaking his head. Marcus handing him a soda. No, most stay poor because nobody reminds them they matter. Richard swallowed. Lena noticed his face change. What? He looked at Annie. Your father said I notice things. Annie waited. He said people who notice broken things usually end up building something. Grace lowered the model box. Lena smiled. That sounds like him. Richard nodded. He thought I'd build a company. Annie looked surprised. He really said that? No. The room quieted. Richard smiled slightly. He said I'd either build a company or get fired from every job in Georgia. Lena burst out laughing. Yes, that sounds exactly like Marcus. Even Annie laughed. The tension in the room loosened. For a moment it felt less like strangers standing in an archive room and more like people leaving a family dinner too late. They stepped into the hallway. The lights were dimmer now. At the exit Lena paused. Richard. He looked up. Come by sometime. Annie blinked. Lena continued. We still make meatloaf. Richard stood still. Mrs. Carter. You disappeared once. Lena adjusted the bag on her shoulder. Don't do it twice. He looked at Annie. The cap. The envelope. The model box in Grace's hands. 30 years ago, Marcus Carter had opened a door for him. Tonight, his family had opened it again. Richard nodded. I'll come. Lena smiled. Outside the foundation building, the city lights had already come on. Annie walked toward the bus stop with the photograph pressed against her chest. Inside the envelope was proof her father had changed a life. She did not know yet that Richard Whitmore was already planning how to change one back. The bus ride home felt shorter than the morning ride. Maybe because Annie no longer carried only the model. The photograph rested inside her backpack beside the folded note from her father. Every few minutes her hand drifted toward the zipper just to make sure it was still there. Lena sat beside her near the window. Tired, quiet. Atlanta lights moved past outside. You okay? Lena asked. Annie nodded. No, you're not. Annie smiled faintly. You always know. I raised you. Silence settled again. Then Annie asked softly, why didn't you tell me? Lena looked out the window. About Richard? Annie nodded. You were little. Lena folded her hands. Then life got busy. Bills. Work. Your father getting sick. She paused. Some stories got packed away. Annie touched the brim of the cap. Dad really kept newspaper articles about him? Lena smiled. Whole shoebox. Why? Because Marcus liked seeing people make it. The bus stopped. A few passengers got off. Lena continued quietly. Your father never measured people by what they owned. She looked at Annie. He measured them by what they became after someone helped them. Annie lowered her eyes. Across town, Richard Whitmore sat alone in his office. The foundation building had emptied an hour ago. Only cleaning crews remained. Marcus Carter's file sat open on his desk. Beside it lay Annie's application essay and the old score sheets. He leaned back. The office windows reflected the city lights. On the shelf behind him stood awards, magazine covers, photographs with governors and donors. He looked at none of them. His phone vibrated. David Reynolds. The dean. Richard answered. You left without saying goodbye. Richard smiled faintly. Long day. David's voice stayed quiet. You changed the competition. I know. You also told a room full of people you were wrong. Richard looked at the file. Yes. Silence. Then David said, Marcus Carter must have mattered. Richard stared out the window. He did. How much? Richard thought about the porch, the meatloaf, the couch, the blue truck, a hungry young laborer sleeping in parking lots. Enough that I'm sitting in this office because he existed. David said nothing after that. The call ended. Richard opened Annie's essay again. The last line stopped him now the way it had earlier. I want to build places where working families are treated like they belong. He reached for his laptop, opened the scholarship records. Build Tomorrow's Scholarship. Full tuition. Housing support. Mentorship. One winner. Richard closed the page, then opened another file. Community Builders Initiative. Development Grant. Project Incubation. Professional Mentorship. He stared at it. Not enough. He opened a blank document. Title, Marcus Carter Legacy Award. Richard stopped typing. The office grew quiet again. Back at home, Annie unlocked the apartment door. The familiar smell of detergent and leftover food greeted them. Small kitchen, old fridge, bills tucked under a magnet. The same place her father had sat every evening after work. Lena placed the food bag on the counter. Annie removed the photograph. She carried it to the kitchen table. Under the light, her father looked young, alive, laughing. She touched the image. You knew him before me, she whispered. Lena stood behind her. He was still your father. Annie nodded. Then she noticed something. At the edge of the photo, Halfhide, a child's drawing taped behind Marcus. Square building, trees, porch. She frowned. Mom? Lena leaned down. What? This drawing. Lena looked. Her face softened immediately. Oh, what is it? Lena smiled through tired eyes. That was yours. Annie blinked. What? You drew it when you were 8. On the Staret. The building looked simple. Crooked windows, stick trees, small porch. Written at the top in uneven letters. Library for everybody. Lena sat down. Your father taped it inside his truck. Annie looked at her. He carried it for years. Silence filled the kitchen. The old clock ticked above the stove. Annie looked back at the drawing. Library for everybody. Her fingers trembled slightly. Future Block suddenly felt older than 6 months. Older than the competition. Older than grief. Lena touched her shoulder. You started building a long time ago. Across the city, Richard printed the document. Marcus Carter Legacy Award. Full architecture scholarship. Living expenses. Community project funding. Mentorship. Guaranteed internship. He stared at the page. The debt no longer felt abstract. It had shape now. Name. Purpose. He signed the bottom. Outside his office window, Atlanta moved through another ordinary night. Inside, a promise had just been made. Neither Annie nor Lena knew it yet. But Marcus Carter was about to build one more thing. The next morning, Annie woke before her alarm. The photograph still sat on the kitchen table. Sunlight reached only half of it. Marcus smiling. Young Richard beside him. And behind them, the crooked drawing she had made at 8 years old. Library for everybody. Annie stood there longer than she meant to. Lena entered wearing scrubs again. Coffee in hand. You slept? A little. Lena looked at the photo. I forgot that drawing was in there. You never told me he kept it. Lena smiled tiredly. Your father kept everything you made. Anya sat down. Even bad drawings? Especially bad drawings. They laughed quietly. Lena checked the time. I have to go. Annie nodded. At the door, Lena stopped. Mail comes today. Okay. The college letters. Annie's shoulders stiffened. The apartment went quiet. Lena touched her arm. No matter what happens, yesterday still happened. Then she left. Across town, Richard Whitmore arrived at the foundation earlier than usual. Grace was already there. Coffee. Laptop. 3 open folders. She looked up as he entered. You're early. So are you. Grace pointed at the folders. I did what you asked. Richard sat. The first folder held scholarship records. The second contained community builders documentation. The third was labeled Marcus Carter Legacy Award. Grace tapped it. You were serious. Yes. She leaned back. This is bigger than a scholarship. It should be. Grace studied him. You really owe this man. Richard looked through the glass wall toward the city. I do. Grace opened another file. There's something else. Richard looked up. Annie's financial aid reports. He frowned. Why? She submitted them for the program. Grace slid the papers over. Household income. Lena Carter. Night nurse. No savings. No college fund. Projected architecture tuition. Richard read quietly. The number sat on the page like a locked door. Grace spoke softly. She probably can't go. Richard already knew. He had seen that answer in Annie's face the moment she said community college. At that moment his assistant entered. "Mr. Whitmore, your 10 o'clock moved to 11. He nodded. "Also," she hesitated, "someone left this downstairs." She placed a small cardboard box on his desk. Old, tape worn thin, no return address. Richard opened it. Inside sat newspaper clippings. "Whitmore Systems expands. Young entrepreneur wins state award. Technology founder opens first office." Grace stared. Richard did not move. At the bottom lay a folded note. The handwriting stopped him. "Marcus, keep building. Better days are coming. Proud of you. M. C." The room went still. Grace whispered, "Where did this come from?" Richard turned the envelope over. One line written on the back. "Found in Marcus Carter's garage after cleanup. Lena Carter." Richard sat down slowly. The shoebox. He had thought Lena was joking. She was not. Marcus had kept every article, every success, every step, without ever calling, without asking for anything. Grace lowered her voice. "You okay?" Richard looked at the note. No, he was not. At home, Annie opened the mailbox. Electric bill, grocery flyer, one large envelope, Georgia State University. She stared at it. Her fingers suddenly felt cold. Inside the apartment, she sat at the table. The photograph remained there, Marcus smiling. Watching, Annie opened the envelope. "Congratulations." Her eyes moved down the page. "Accepted. Architecture program." She smiled, then kept reading. "Estimated yearly cost." The smile disappeared. The number sat on the paper. Impossible. The apartment felt smaller. She folded the letter, placed it beside the photograph. "I got in," she whispered. The room stayed quiet. Her eyes moved to her father. "I just can't go." Across town, Richard still held Marcus's note. "Keep building. Better days are coming." His phone rang. Lena Carter. He answered immediately. "Mrs. Carter?" Her voice sounded tired. "I found the box." Richard closed his eyes. "I know. He kept everything." "Yes." Silence. Then Lena said quietly, "She got accepted today." Richard sat straighter. "To architecture?" "Yes." He already knew the next part. "She can't afford it," Lena said. The office became still. Grace looked up. Richard held Marcus's note tighter. Lena spoke again. "She won't tell you that." Her voice lowered. "She'll smile and say community college." Richard looked at the scholarship document on his desk. Then the note. Then the newspaper clippings. 30 years of silent pride packed into one box. "Mrs. Carter." "Yes?" "Don't tell Annie anything yet." Lena paused. "What are you doing?" Richard looked at the signed document. "Marcus Carter Legacy Award." He answered quietly. "Finishing a debt." 3 days passed. Annie said nothing about the acceptance letter. She folded it back into the envelope and slid it beneath her sketchbook on the kitchen shelf. Every morning she looked at it. Every morning she left it there. Lena noticed. She said nothing too. The apartment moved through its usual rhythm. Coffee before dawn. Hospital shifts. Bills on the counter. Laundry chair by the window. Annie worked extra hours at the grocery store after school ended. At night she added small changes to future blocks. A larger workshop. More benches. Another porch. Across town, Richard Whitmore canceled 2 meetings. Grace noticed by the second day. "You hate canceling meetings." "I know." "You canceled donors." "I know." "You rescheduled investors." Richard looked up from the papers on his desk. "I still know." Grace folded her arms. "What are you building?" Richard slid the folder toward her. "Marcus Carter Legacy Award. Final draft. Full architecture scholarship. Housing. Books. Living expenses. Community project funding. Internship placement." Grace read the last page. "Public announcement ceremony." Her eyes lifted. "You're making this public?" "Yes." "Why?" Richard looked toward the box of newspaper clippings. "Because Marcus never got thanked." Grace stayed quiet. The office phone rang. His assistant entered. "Mrs. Carter is here." Richard stood immediately. Lena entered carrying a paper bag. Grace smiled. "Please tell me that's not more meatloaf." Lena handed her the bag. "It's cornbread today." Grace looked delighted. Richard closed the office door. Lena sat. "You asked me to wait." He nodded. "So?" Richard handed her the folder. She read silently. Halfway down the page, she stopped. Marcus Carter Legacy Award. Her eyes moved slower after that. By the end, she sat very still. Richard. She got into architecture school. Lena looked up. She won't go. No. She already decided community college. I know. Lena closed the folder. She won't accept charity. Richard shook his head. It isn't charity. What is it? He looked at Marcus's note on the desk. Payment. The room stayed quiet. Grace pretended not to listen and failed completely. Lena smiled sadly. Marcus would argue with you. Probably. He'd say helping people isn't debt. Richard nodded. He'd be wrong. Lena laughed softly. No. She stood. He'd just be Marcus. Richard walked her to the door. Before leaving, she stopped. There's one thing you should know. He waited. She still talks to him. Richard frowned slightly. Marcus? Lena nodded. Kitchen table. Late at night. She smiled. Like he still sits there. Richard looked down. After Lena left, he remained by the window for a long time. That evening, Annie sat exactly where Lena said she would. Kitchen table. Sketchbook open. Acceptance letter beside her. The photograph rested against the sugar jar. She drew quietly. Porch. Trees. Workshop. The front sign now read, Marcus Community Learning Center. She stopped, looked at the name, then at the photo. I got in, she said softly. The room remained still. I just can't do it. She smiled a little. You probably knew that already. The old clock ticked. Outside, a siren passed somewhere far away. Annie touched the edge of the photograph. I'm trying, Dad. A knock interrupted her. Lena entered. You have mail. Annie frowned. Mail? Lena handed over an envelope. Whitmore Future Foundation. Anya Stoddett. Inside sat a card. Miss Annie Carter, you and your family are invited to attend a private recognition ceremony this Friday at Whitmore Future Foundation. Please bring your Future Blocks model. Formal attire not required. Annie read the last line twice. Formal attire not required. She looked up slowly. Lena smiled. That was for you. Annie laughed despite herself. Across town, Richard stood alone inside the foundation event hall. The room was empty except for workers arranging chairs. At the center of the stage stood a covered display. Grace entered carrying papers. All set. Richard nodded. She looked toward the covered stand. You nervous? He actually thought about it. Yes. Grace smiled. Good. Richard looked at the stage. 30 years earlier, Marcus Carter had opened a couch to a stranger. Friday, he would open something else. Not just for Annie, for the man whose name had waited too long. Grace handed him the final program. He read the title, Marcus Carter Legacy Award Ceremony. Below it, honoring the builders who never got credit. Richard folded the paper. The debt was almost finished. He just hoped Annie would let him pay it. Friday arrived warm and bright. Annie stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of the only cream blouse she owned. The old construction cap sat on the sink. Lena stepped into the doorway. You nervous? Yes. Good. Annie smiled. You sound like Grace. Then Grace is smart. Lena held up Marcus's photograph. You taking this? Annie nodded. And the model? Already packed. Lena looked toward the cap. You wearing it? Annie reached for it without hesitation. Yes. Lena smiled. That's my girl. An hour later, they entered the Whitmore Future Foundation again. The lobby looked different. Smaller somehow. Less intimidating. Grace waited near the entrance. The moment she saw them, she waved. You came. Annie looked around. No donors? Grace shook her head. No sponsors either. The hall behind her held only a few rows of chairs. Staff. Some judges. Foundation employees. At the front stood a covered display. Annie frowned. What is this? Grace smiled carefully. You'll see. Richard approached from the stage. Dark suit. No tie. For the first time, Annie had seen him dressed simply. He looked at the cap, then at the model box. You brought it. You asked me to. He nodded. Good. Lena sat in the second row. Grace guided Annie toward the front. The architect judge stood nearby. So did the nonprofit director. Even the older security guard from the first day had come. Annie noticed him immediately. He gave a small, embarrassed smile. Sorry again, he said quietly. Annie smiled back. It's okay. The ceremony began without music. Without introductions, Richard walked onto the stage carrying only one sheet of paper. He looked at the room, then at Annie. A week ago, he began, I asked security to remove a young woman from this building. The room stayed quiet. I saw old boots, a worn hoodie, a construction cap. He paused. I thought she did not belong. Annie lowered her eyes. Richard continued. I was wrong. He looked toward the covered display. Because that cap belonged to Marcus Carter. Lena gripped her hands. Richard's voice remained steady. 30 years ago I was a laborer outside Macon. Unpaid, broke, sleeping in my truck. Nobody moved. A man named Marcus Carter brought me home. Grace looked toward Annie. Richard continued. He gave me food when he barely had enough, a couch when I had nowhere else to sleep. He looked at Lena. And meatloaf. Soft laughter moved through the room. Richard smiled briefly. Then I left. Silence returned. I built a company. His eyes lowered. He built people. The room stayed still. Richard stepped toward the covered stand. For 30 years I never thanked him. He pulled away the cloth. Annie stopped breathing. A bronze plaque stood beneath it. Marcus Carter Legacy Award. Honoring the builders who lifted others before themselves. Lena covered her mouth. Grace looked away quickly. The security guard lowered his head. Richard turned toward Annie. This award will be given every year. Anya Staret. For students building communities. He paused. Beginning today. He lifted an envelope from the stand. Miss Annie Carter. She stood slowly. The room watched. Richard stepped down from the stage. No podium now. No distance. Only the two of them. He handed her the envelope. Her hands trembled opening it. Full architecture scholarship. Housing support. Living expenses. Community project funding. Internship placement. Marcus Carter Legacy recipient. Annie looked up immediately. No. Her voice broke. Richard nodded once. Yes. The room blurred. Lena was crying openly now. Grace too. Annie looked at the paper again. Georgia State University. Fully funded. Her eyes moved back to Richard. I can't take this. Richard shook his head. Yes, you can. No, you already earned it. Silence. Annie gripped the envelope. Richard looked at the cap. Your father gave me a future when I had none. His voice lowered. Let me return one. Annie's shoulders shook. Lena stood and walked forward. She placed Marcus's photograph into Annie's hands. Young Marcus smiling. Arm around young Richard. The man who fed strangers. The man who saved newspaper clippings in a shoebox. The man who carried an 8-year-old girl's drawing inside his truck. Annie looked at the photo, then at the scholarship, then at Richard. You really remembered him. Richard smiled. No. She looked up. I finally stopped forgetting him. The room stayed quiet. Outside the foundation windows, Atlanta moved through another ordinary afternoon. Inside, a builder who never asked for credit had just been honored, and his daughter was finally being seen the way he always saw her. 1 year later, the sign went up just after sunrise. Marcus Carter Learning Center. The workers stepped back. Fresh wood, new brick, wide front porch, reading rooms, workshop space, courtyard, exactly where future blocks once stood as paper and glue on a folding table. Annie stood beneath the sign wearing a navy work jacket over jeans. The old construction cap remained on her head. The tear near the seam was still there. She never fixed it. Grace walked out carrying coffee. You've been staring at that sign 10 minutes. Annie smiled. I know. Grace handed her a cup. Architect student now. Community project lead. Scholarship recipient. She looked around. Your father would be unbearable today. Annie laughed. He would inspect everything. He would absolutely inspect everything. Lena came through the front entrance carrying a tray of cornbread. Hospital badge still clipped to her jacket. Some things never changed. You two standing around or working? Grace took a piece immediately. Working. Lena looked at the porch. Her eyes softened. Marcus would have loved this place. Kids already waited outside with parents. Older neighbors sat on the porch benches before opening time. No one had asked permission. They simply sat. Exactly as Marcus would have wanted. Inside the workshop, a plaque hung on the wall. Every good building needs a place where people can stay without buying anything. Marcus Carter. Annie placed her hand beneath the words. Footsteps sounded behind her. She turned. Richard Whitmore stood at the entrance. No suit today. Work boots. Simple jacket. He held a small toolbox. Grace blinked. Okay, that's unexpected. Richard lifted the box. I was told there would be work. Lena smiled immediately. About time. Annie laughed. Richard looked around the building. Library shelves. Workshop benches, children's reading corner, the porch. He stopped there. Same place. Same idea. Just real now. Annie stepped beside him. We built it. Richard nodded. No. He looked toward the sign outside. He did. The opening ceremony began an hour later. Neighbors filled the courtyard. Former workers from Marcus's old crews came. One man brought an old photograph. Another carried a tape measure Marcus once lent him and never got back. Stories moved through the crowd. He fixed my porch. He rebuilt our church steps. He brought lunch every Friday. Lena smiled through all of it. Richard listened quietly. For years he had lived inside boardrooms. Today he stood among builders. It felt more honest. At the front entrance, Annie placed the old photograph beside the ribbon. Young Marcus. Young Richard. Construction cap. Laughing. The ribbon was cut. Applause followed. Children ran toward the library first. Parents drifted to the porch. Older neighbors claimed the benches. No one rushed. No one bought anything. People simply stayed. Annie stepped away from the crowd. She climbed the small ladder beside the workshop beam. The old cap rested in her hands now. Richard looked up. Lena stopped talking. Grace lowered her coffee. Annie tied the cap carefully around the wooden beam above the workshop entrance. The cloth moved slightly in the breeze. She stepped down. Silence settled around them. Annie looked up at it, then spoke softly. We kept building, Dad. Lena wiped her eyes. Grace looked away. Richard stood very still. 30 years earlier, Marcus Carter had handed food to a hungry laborer. He never asked for repayment. Never called. Never collected. He simply kept building. People. Porches. Second chances. Richard looked at the cap above the beam. Then at Annie. Architecture student. Builder. Dream still alive. The debt was gone now. In its place stood a building. Outside, children laughed in the courtyard. Someone carried books onto the porch. An older man sat down and stayed. The afternoon light moved across the sign. Marcus Carter Learning Center. The man who built places for other people finally had one carrying his name. And inside it, his daughter was still building. This story reminds us that true builders are not always the people whose names appear on buildings, but the ones who quietly lift others when no one is watching. Marcus Carter never became rich, never asked for recognition, yet his kindness changed a life and continued shaping the future long after he was gone. The story also warns against judging people by appearance, because dignity, talent, and greatness often arrive wearing worn clothes and carrying invisible struggles. In the end, kindness is never wasted, justice may arrive quietly, and the good we leave in others can outlive us and become our greatest legacy. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.